Most gardeners do not lose their bean harvest because they planted the wrong seeds. They lose it because they wait too long to pick the beans, and by the time they notice what is happening, the plants have already started slowing down. I made that mistake for years, and I thought bigger pods meant a bigger harvest, but I learned the hard way that one old pod left hanging can be more important than it looks. When green beans or yellow beans stay on the plant too long, the seeds inside keep growing and the plant begins to act as if its work is nearly finished. That is when flowers become fewer and the next wave of young beans becomes smaller. If you have ever had a row that looked full of promise and then suddenly seemed to stop producing, you may have seen this without knowing the reason. I remember walking through my garden one morning and finding more beans than I could carry only a few days after I had picked the last ones. Then I got busy and left the plants alone for several days. When I came back, many of those young pods had become large and tough, and the plants were not making nearly as many new flowers. An older gardener had told me years before that a bean row should never become a place where old pods are left hanging. At the time, I thought it was just another old garden saying. Later, I understood what he meant. Beans reward attention more than complicated feeding, and that is good news because you do not need expensive products to keep them producing. You need good soil, enough sunlight, steady moisture, and the habit of checking the plants often. In this video, I want to show you how I grow young beans and green and yellow string beans, so I can keep harvesting for much longer instead of getting one short flush and then watching the plants fade. I will show you where I start with the seeds, how I keep the soil from drying out, how I avoid a common feeding mistake, and most importantly, how I harvest so the plant keeps making more flowers and pods. But there is one small harvesting habit that many people overlook, and it can quietly make the difference between a garden that gives you beans for a short time and one that keeps filling your basket week after week. For years, I made the same mistake with beans because I thought the answer to a smaller harvest was always more fertilizer. When the plants slowed down, I would look at the leaves and think they needed more food, so I would add something and wait for the plants to become stronger. Sometimes the leaves did become darker and fuller, but the basket did not fill the way I expected. That taught me an important lesson because a bean plant can look very healthy and still give you fewer beans than it should. One of the biggest problems is too much feeding, especially when the fertilizer pushes the plant toward leaves instead of flowers and pods. I have seen rows that looked beautiful from a distance, thick green leaves everywhere, but when I stepped closer there were very few young beans hiding underneath. Most gardeners make this mistake because it seems logical that more fertilizer must mean more harvest. I used to think the same way, but beans are one of those vegetables where simple care often works better than constantly adding something new. If your soil already has finished compost and drains properly, you may not need to keep buying products every time production slows. I learned to look at the whole plant first. Are the leaves healthy? Are there flowers? Is the soil staying reasonably moist? Is the plant getting enough sunlight? Are old pods still hanging somewhere under the leaves? Those questions usually tell me much more than a bag of fertilizer does. Another mistake is watering only when the leaves begin to look tired. By then, the plant may already have been under stress for hours, especially during hot weather. I prefer checking the soil near the roots and giving a deeper drink when the ground has genuinely started to dry. Then I leave it alone instead of watering again and again just because the surface looks dry. A thin layer of straw or dry leaves can make this much easier because it slows evaporation and keeps the soil from changing so quickly during hot days. It costs almost nothing, and it can save both water and work. But there is one thing I learned that made an even bigger difference than feeding or watering, and it happens after the first beans appear. Most people wait for the pods to become large because they think that means they are getting more food. I did too. Then I learned why those large pods can quietly tell the plant to slow down, and once I understood that, I started harvesting my beans very differently. Years ago, I was helping an older neighbor in his garden when he showed me the part of bean growing that I had completely overlooked. He was already well into his 70s at the time, and he moved slowly through the rows with a small basket in one hand and a pair of scissors in the other. I remember thinking he was taking far too much time because I could see beans hanging everywhere, and I thought the job was simply to collect as many as possible. But he did not rush. He looked under the leaves, he checked the lower branches, he touched each pod before deciding whether it was ready. Then he stopped at one plant and showed me a large bean that I would have been proud to put in my basket. He picked it and said that this was the kind of bean he wanted to find as little as possible. I did not understand until he explained that he was not growing beans just to get a large harvest today. He was growing them so the plants would keep making another harvest tomorrow and the day after that. That simple idea stayed with me. I started watching my own plants in a different way, and I noticed something I had ignored for years. The young green and yellow pods were the ones I wanted most, but the older pods hidden behind the leaves were quietly changing the plant. When I removed them regularly, new flowers kept appearing and fresh pods followed. When I ignored the plants for a week, the beans became larger and tougher, and the next harvest seemed smaller. The old gardener had another habit that I still use today. He never depended on one planting to provide everything. If he had a little empty space and the weather was still warm enough, he planted another small row. That way, the first planting could slow down naturally while the younger plants were just beginning to produce. It meant he was not waiting for one crop to give him everything at once. He was creating a steady supply. That method costs almost nothing, and it is especially useful if you are growing beans for a small household because you do not need a mountain of beans arriving on the same weekend. You want a basket today and another basket a few days later. I began doing the same thing, and suddenly the garden felt much easier to manage. I was not chasing a huge harvest all at once anymore. I was building a longer harvest with small actions repeated through the season. But there was one more lesson that neighbor taught me about the soil itself, and it was so simple that I had walked past it hundreds of times without realizing how much it could help the plants. The main method I use now is very simple, and it starts with the soil, because beans do not need a complicated garden to produce well. I like to give them loose soil that drains properly but still holds enough moisture around the roots. If I have finished compost available, I mix it into the soil before planting, and then I leave the expensive products on the shelf unless the plants clearly show a problem. An older gardener once told me that beans should not be spoiled, and I understand that better now than I did when I was younger. Too much fertilizer, especially one that is heavy in nitrogen, can give you a beautiful wall of green leaves, while the number of flowers and pods stays disappointing. I would rather have a slightly simpler-looking plant covered with young beans than a giant plant that looks impressive but gives me little for the kitchen. When I plant bush beans, I also give them plenty of sunlight because good light is one of the simplest things we can provide for free. Around 6 to 8 hours of sunlight works well for the kinds of beans I grow, and if the weather becomes extremely hot, I may give young plants a little afternoon protection until they settle in. Then comes the small trick that costs almost nothing. After sowing the seeds, I spread a very light layer of straw or shredded dry leaves over the soil. I'm not trying to bury the seeds or cover the young plants. I simply want enough material to slow the loss of moisture and stop the surface from becoming hard and dry. This old habit is easy to overlook, but it can make germination much more even, because the soil stays comfortable instead of changing from wet to dry too quickly. Once the plants are growing, I keep the moisture steady rather than giving tiny amounts whenever I happen to walk past with a hose. I check the soil and water when it actually needs it. That saves water and helps the plants avoid the stress that can slow flowering. But the real change comes when the first pods are ready. I do not wait for them to become as large as possible. I pick them while they are young and tender, and I return to the row often, because that is when the simple system starts working in our favor. Each harvest removes pods that would otherwise mature, and the plant has a reason to keep producing new flowers and young beans. Most gardeners understand the picking part, but very few realize how much the timing of that picking can change the length of the whole harvest. One of the biggest mistakes I still see is that gardeners become too helpful when the first harvest starts to slow down. They see fewer beans in the basket and immediately reach for more fertilizer or start watering every evening because they think the plant must be hungry or thirsty. I used to do exactly that, and sometimes I made the problem worse. If the leaves are still healthy and the plant is still producing flowers, I do not rush to feed it. I first look for the simple things that may be holding it back. I check for mature pods hiding under the leaves because one forgotten bean can become large surprisingly quickly in warm weather. I remove those old pods even if they are no longer the size I want for eating. Then I look for yellow or badly damaged leaves and remove only those leaves that have clearly finished their work. I never strip healthy green leaves just to make the plant look cleaner because those leaves are still helping the plant produce energy. After that, I check the soil with my hand a couple of inches down. If it still feels cool and slightly damp, I leave it alone. If it feels dry, I water slowly and deeply instead of giving the plant another quick sprinkle. This is one of those old habits that costs nothing but saves a surprising amount of water. I also keep a thin layer of straw or shredded dry leaves around the plants while leaving a little space around the stems. It helps the soil stay cooler and slows evaporation during hot weather. Then comes the part that many gardeners skip when a row begins to look tired. I give the plants a simple reset. I clear away the old pods. I remove only the leaves that are yellow or badly damaged. I water deeply if the soil needs it, and if the soil looks poor, I add a thin layer of finished compost around the plants. Nothing fancy and nothing expensive. I remember one summer when I was almost ready to pull out a row because production had become disappointing. After this simple cleanup, I left the plants alone and kept harvesting. A few days passed, and then I noticed new flowers appearing. Those flowers became small pods and the row started filling the basket again. That was when I stopped thinking of beans as a single harvest. With the right routine, a healthy plant can give you several waves of food. But there is another way I learned to make those waves even more dependable, and it begins with planting a second small row before the first one is finished. Once I understood that regular picking was the heart of a long bean harvest, I stopped trying to make one planting do all the work. Instead, I began using a simple rhythm that gives me beans for much longer and takes very little extra effort. When the first row is producing heavily, I let it do its job, but I keep another small planting ready to follow behind it. I do not need a huge second row because I am not trying to harvest everything at once. A few short lines of bush beans can be enough to keep the kitchen supplied when the first plants begin slowing down. This is one of those old methods that costs almost nothing because you are simply using a little garden space more wisely. One row may be covered with flowers while the second is still small and green. Then, as the first row begins to fade, the younger plants are just reaching the stage where they can take over. I learned to think of this as passing the basket from one row to another instead of waiting for one group of plants to carry the whole season. There is another advantage to this approach that I did not appreciate when I was younger. It takes the pressure off you. If you miss a few beans on an older plant, you are not losing your entire season because another planting is already coming along. And if the weather turns difficult and one planting suffers, you still have another group with a chance to recover. I also use this time to keep the old plants clean. When I walk through the rows, I pick every young pod that is ready and remove the oversized ones that I missed earlier. I check beneath the leaves and around the lower stems because that is where hidden pods often escape notice. I keep the soil evenly supplied with moisture and use simple mulch when I have straw or dry leaves available. If the soil is poor, I add a little finished compost instead of reaching immediately for a strong fertilizer. These small habits do not look impressive, but together they make the garden much more dependable. After a few weeks, I began noticing something I had never paid attention to before. The plants that were harvested often seemed to stay active longer, while the rows that I ignored for several days quickly filled with old pods and fewer new flowers. That was when I realized the real goal was not to force the plant to produce more. It was to keep giving it the conditions and the reason to continue producing. And there is one final harvesting detail that makes this whole routine work even better. especially with yellow and green beans, because picking them at the right stage changes not only the quality of what goes into your basket, but also what happens on the plant afterward. The biggest lesson I learned from growing beans for so many years is that a long harvest usually does not come from doing more work. It comes from noticing the small things and repeating the right habits before the plants have a chance to slow down. When I walk through my garden now, I do not look only at how many beans are in the basket. I look under the leaves for pods I may have missed. I check whether the soil still has enough moisture. I look at the flowers and the new growth. If the plant is still green and active, I give it a chance instead of assuming the season is finished. When production begins to fall, I first make a thorough harvest and remove the old pods. Then I take away only the yellow or damaged leaves. I water deeply if the soil is dry and add a thin layer of finished compost when the plants need gentle support. That simple reset has brought tired bean plants back into production for me more than once. I also keep planting small batches when the weather allows, because a second young row can take over just as the first row begins to slow down. There is no expensive secret here. The old method is simply to keep the soil comfortable and the plants picked. I remember what that older gardener told me years ago. Do not wait for the plant to tell you that it is finished. Pay attention before that happens. That advice changed the way I garden. Now I can walk outside every few days with a small basket and come back with enough beans for dinner without needing a complicated system. Green beans and yellow wax beans are especially rewarding because you can eat them young and tender, and you can keep harvesting them while the plants continue producing. If you want more beans from the same space this season, remember the simple routine. Give them good soil and sunlight. Keep the moisture steady. Do not push them with too much fertilizer. Pick the pods while they are young and keep checking the plants often. Remove the old pods and tired leaves when needed, and start another small planting before the first one is completely finished. These habits are simple enough to repeat every season, and they cost almost nothing. And that is what I like most about them. You are not buying a complicated solution. You are simply paying attention to the plant. Once you start doing that, you may notice something else in your garden too. Some vegetables can be kept producing much longer with the same kind of simple harvest rhythm, and that is the old garden habit I want to explore with you in the next video,